The slap echoed across Rosie's diner like a gunshot in a quiet valley. Conversations stopped instantly. Coffee cups froze halfway to waiting lips. Every eye in the restaurant turned toward the elderly woman standing beside the corner booth. Dorothy Washington touched her cheek gently. The sting spread across her skin, but her expression never changed. She did not cry. She did not shout. She simply looked at the man who had struck her. Richard Sterling stood tall in his expensive tailored suit. His chest rose and fell heavily. Anger still burned inside him, fueled by a lifetime of believing that wealth and status placed him above everyone else. Around him, several customers raised their phones. Cameras recorded every second. Outside, dark clouds drifted across the Chicago sky. A cold autumn wind rattled the diner windows. Inside, the atmosphere felt even colder. Dorothy had begun her morning like every other Tuesday. She woke before sunrise in her modest apartment on the city's south side. Family photographs decorated every wall. Her late husband's military medals rested inside a glass case. Books filled shelves from floor to ceiling. The home reflected a life built through discipline, education, and quiet sacrifice. For 40 years, Dorothy had worked as an educator. She had guided thousands of students through difficult circumstances. Some became doctors. Others became attorneys, business leaders, judges, and public servants. Many still called her every Mother's Day. That morning, her son Vincent had called before work. "Good morning, Ma." His voice always carried warmth when speaking to her. "Morning, sweetheart," Dorothy replied. "Lunch with Helen today?" Same booth, same diner, same gossip. Vincent laughed. "Be careful out there." "I'm 72, Vincent, not 12. Still, humor me." The call ended after a few minutes. Dorothy smiled as she placed the phone down. She loved that no matter how successful Vincent became, he still worried like a devoted son. Across downtown Chicago, Richard Sterling's day had unfolded very differently. His law office occupied the top floor of a luxury tower overlooking Lake Michigan. He specialized in representing powerful corporations. Wealthy executives admired him. Employees feared him. Sterling believed success gave him permission to treat others however he wished. By lunchtime, several small frustrations had already spoiled his mood. Traffic delays, a missed conference call, a cancelled business meeting. None of them truly mattered, yet each added another layer to his irritation. When he entered Rosie's diner, he immediately disliked everything he saw. The worn booths, the neighborhood regulars, the lack of luxury. To him, the place represented people he considered beneath him. Then came the accident. Dorothy's elbow lightly brushed his table while reaching for sugar. His coffee spilled onto legal documents resting beside him. She apologized immediately. "I'm terribly sorry. Let me help clean that up." But Richard Sterling did not want an apology. He wanted someone to blame. What followed shocked everyone inside the diner. Insults became racial slurs. Complaints became threats. Dorothy remained calm throughout the confrontation. Her composure seemed to infuriate him even more. Finally, his anger exploded into violence. Now silence filled the restaurant. Dorothy looked directly into Sterling's eyes. "You have no idea what you've just done," she said quietly. The words carried no threat. Somehow that made them more unsettling. Sterling adjusted his tie and forced a smug smile. "You're nobody," he replied. Across the room, a well-dressed man slowly lowered his newspaper. He had witnessed everything. His hand moved toward his phone. Outside, police sirens began to approach. Inside, Dorothy's wedding ring rested near the stranger's polished shoes. As he picked it up carefully, he made a single phone call. The person answering listened silently for 20 seconds. Then the voice on the other end spoke only 6 words. "Tell me exactly what happened." Vincent Washington stood alone inside a private conference room overlooking downtown Chicago. Rain streaked the glass walls while the city lights flickered below. The call had ended less than a minute earlier, yet the room felt different now. Dangerously different. The man who had called was not prone to exaggeration. He had served beside Vincent for nearly 20 years, calm, disciplined, and observant. If he sounded shaken, something serious had happened. Vincent replayed every word in his mind. An elderly woman, a public assault, a racial tirade, a slap. His mother. For several moments he remained motionless. Anyone who knew Vincent understood this silence. It was never indecision, it was calculation. Outside the room, senior executives waited for a business presentation scheduled weeks earlier. Millions of dollars depended on the meeting. None of that mattered anymore. Vincent reached for his phone. "Cancel everything," he told his assistant. "Everything, sir?" "Everything." The line went dead. Across the city, Dorothy sat quietly inside a police station interview room. A detective took her statement while Helen Morrison remained beside her. "Mrs. Washington," the detective said gently, "are you sure you don't need medical attention?" Dorothy smiled politely. "I've survived worse than a bruised cheek." The detective nodded, though something about her answer lingered. Most people would have been furious. Some would have demanded revenge. Dorothy seemed more disappointed than angry, as if Richard Sterling had failed some test of basic humanity. Meanwhile, social media exploded. The first video reached 10,000 views within an hour, then 50,000, then 500,000. People across the country watched Sterling's outburst. They watched his insults. They watched the moment his hand struck Dorothy's face. Comment sections filled with outrage. Local reporters rushed toward Rosie's diner. Civil rights organizations began sharing the footage. Former clients of Sterling's law firm started posting their own stories. A pattern slowly emerged. This was not the first time Richard Sterling had treated people this way. It was merely the first time cameras had captured it. At 7 that evening, Sterling sat inside his penthouse apartment overlooking the lake. Television screens displayed news coverage of the incident. He muted the volume. The reporters irritated him. The public outrage irritated him. Most of all, Dorothy Washington irritated him. She should have accepted the humiliation and disappeared. Instead, she had become the center of a growing national conversation. Sterling poured himself a glass of expensive whiskey. "This will pass," he muttered. He believed his wealth would protect him. His connections would protect him. His reputation would protect him. For decades, they always had. At that exact moment, Vincent entered a private office inside an old brick building near Chicago's riverfront. Several trusted associates waited inside. Large monitors displayed financial records, legal databases, and corporate filings. Vincent dropped a photograph onto the table. "Richard Sterling." "Everything," Vincent said. No further explanation was needed. The room immediately came alive. Researchers opened laptops. Investigators made phone calls. Analysts searched public records. Vincent sat quietly at the head of the table. Hours passed. A file slowly began to grow. Financial irregularities, hidden debts, confidential settlements, former employees willing to speak, former clients willing to testify. Every hour revealed another crack beneath Sterling's polished image. Shortly before midnight, Vincent received a message. The first complete report had arrived. He read every page carefully. By the final page, his expression had hardened. Richard Sterling was not simply an arrogant man. He was a man whose entire career depended upon people remaining silent, people afraid to fight back, people lacking resources, people he believed nobody would defend. Vincent closed the file. For the first time all evening, he spoke. "No shortcuts," he said. Everyone looked toward him. "My mother deserves justice, not revenge." Several heads nodded. "Use the law, use facts, use the truth." The room remained silent. Vincent stood and walked toward the window. Chicago stretched endlessly beneath the storm clouds. Somewhere across that city, Richard Sterling was preparing for bed. Confident, untouched, still believing he controlled the situation. Vincent stared into the darkness. Then he made 3 phone calls. The first reached a federal investigator. The second reached a district attorney. The third reached a retired judge. Each conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Each person reacted exactly the same way after hearing Dorothy Washington's name. And when Vincent finally ended the last call, he understood something important. Richard Sterling had made one catastrophic mistake. He thought Dorothy Washington was powerless. He had no idea how many lives she had changed during the previous 50 years, or how many powerful people still loved her like family. By sunrise, the story had spread far beyond Chicago. National news programs replayed the diner footage. Radio hosts debated the incident. Legal analysts discussed the growing evidence against Richard Sterling. Across social media, millions of viewers watched the same painful moment. An elderly woman remained calm. A wealthy attorney lost control. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Dorothy Washington woke early as always. Despite the swelling on her cheek, she followed her normal routine. She watered the flowers on her windowsill. She prepared breakfast. She read a chapter from a favorite book. The ordinary rhythm helped steady her thoughts. She had spent her life teaching children that character revealed itself during adversity. Now she found herself living that lesson. At 9 o'clock, a black SUV stopped outside her apartment building. Vincent stepped out. The moment Dorothy opened her door, her son's carefully controlled expression disappeared. He gently touched her bruised cheek. For several seconds, neither spoke. "I'm fine," Dorothy said softly. "No," Vincent replied. "You're strong. That's different." The words lingered. Dorothy recognized the anger hidden beneath his calm exterior. It worried her. As a child, Vincent had always been fiercely protective. If another student was bullied, Vincent intervened. If a neighbor was threatened, Vincent stepped forward. Strength came naturally to him. Mercy had required teaching. "Promise me something," Dorothy said. "Anything. Whatever happens next, don't become the thing you're fighting." Vincent looked away toward the apartment window. Chicago's skyline rose against a gray morning sky. "I promise," he finally said. Meanwhile, Richard Sterling's problems multiplied. When he arrived at his law firm, several partners were already waiting inside the boardroom. No one offered coffee. No one offered greetings. The atmosphere felt like a funeral. Managing partner, Harrison Crawford, placed a folder on the table. "We have a crisis," he said. Sterling rolled his eyes. "Because of one viral video? Because of 23 former complaints?" The room fell silent. Sterling's confidence wavered. Crawford opened the folder. Employment discrimination allegations, hostile workplace complaints, client grievances, confidential settlements. Issues the firm had quietly managed for years suddenly appeared impossible to ignore. "The media is investigating everything," Crawford continued. "Former employees are talking. Clients are calling. Investors are nervous." Sterling felt the first genuine flicker of fear. "You're overreacting." "No, Richard, we underestimated the situation." Another partner slid a tablet across the table. A headline filled the screen. "Prominent attorney faces expanding investigation following assault incident." Below it appeared a second headline. "Former employees allege years of discrimination." Then a third. "Federal agencies reviewing prior cases." Sterling stared silently. The story was growing. Too fast, too far. Elsewhere, investigators began uncovering troubling details. Several former clients described intimidation tactics. Former employees reported racial bias. One retired secretary provided documentation she had quietly preserved for over a decade. Each revelation painted a darker picture. For years, Sterling's position had shielded him. Now that shield was cracking. That afternoon, Vincent met privately with several respected community leaders. Pastors, educators, non-profit directors. People Dorothy had helped throughout her life. Nobody discussed revenge. Nobody discussed punishment. Instead, they discussed accountability. Scholarship programs, legal aid services, community reforms. Vincent listened carefully. The meeting changed him. For the first time, he realized his mother's influence extended far beyond his understanding. Every person around the table carried a story. Dorothy had paid tuition for one, written recommendations for another, provided meals for a struggling family, helped someone overcome addiction, encouraged someone to finish college. Quiet acts, small acts. Yet decades later, those acts still echoed. That evening, Dorothy sat alone in her apartment watching snowfall begin outside. The first flakes drifted gently through the Chicago darkness. Her phone rang. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number. She answered. "Mrs. Washington?" "Yes?" The voice trembled slightly. "You don't remember me, but 27 years ago you taught 5th grade at Lincoln Elementary." Dorothy smiled. "Tell me your name." "Dr. Marcus Reynolds. I'm a heart surgeon in Houston now." Dorothy's eyes widened. She remembered. A quiet boy who struggled with reading. A child everyone underestimated. "I saw what happened," he continued. "I just wanted to say thank you. My life wouldn't exist without you." After the call ended, more followed. A lawyer from New York, a teacher from Detroit, a business owner from Atlanta. One after another, lives she had touched decades earlier. By midnight, Dorothy sat surrounded by memories. Meanwhile, across town, Richard Sterling sat alone in his penthouse. His phone remained silent. No supportive calls, no loyal friends, no grateful former students. Nothing. For the first time in many years, he found himself wondering a troubling question. When everything disappeared, who would stand beside him? The answer was beginning to reveal itself, and it terrified him. The following week brought a level of scrutiny Richard Sterling had never experienced before. For decades, he had controlled the narrative. His money purchased influence. His position commanded respect. His reputation opened doors. Now those same doors were quietly closing. Every morning delivered another unpleasant surprise. A corporate client terminated its contract. A speaking engagement was cancelled. A charitable board requested his resignation. Even his exclusive country club announced a review of his membership status. The collapse happened slowly enough to feel real, and quickly enough to feel unstoppable. Meanwhile, Dorothy Washington found herself becoming something she never wanted to be. A symbol. Reporters camped outside her apartment building. Television producers requested interviews. Civil rights organizations invited her to speak at events. Dorothy politely declined most invitations. She had no interest in fame. What happened inside Rosie's diner was not about her. It was about a problem larger than any individual. When she finally agreed to one interview, the journalist asked a question the millions of viewers wanted answered. "Do you hate Richard Sterling?" Dorothy smiled gently. "No." The reporter looked surprised. "After everything that happened?" "Hatred is heavy," Dorothy replied. "I've carried enough burdens in my life already." The interview aired nationally. Within hours, clips spread across social media. Many viewers expected anger. Instead, they found grace. The contrast only increased public sympathy. At the federal courthouse downtown, investigators continued examining Sterling's professional history. New witnesses emerged almost daily. Former employees described discriminatory hiring practices. Former associates revealed unethical behavior. Several lawsuits that had disappeared years earlier suddenly received renewed attention. One investigator summed it up perfectly. The diner incident didn't create the problem, it exposed it. Across Chicago, Vincent monitored developments carefully. Despite public assumptions, he remained mostly invisible. He avoided interviews. He avoided public appearances. He preferred operating quietly. Yet behind closed doors, he remained busy. Not seeking revenge, seeking truth. Every evening he reviewed reports. Every morning he met with advisors. Every afternoon he visited his mother. Those visits became his favorite part of each day. They reminded him who he was beneath titles, responsibilities, and power. One snowy evening, Vincent arrived carrying groceries. Dorothy laughed. "You realize delivery services exist. You also realize elevators exist, but you still take the stairs for exercise." She couldn't argue with that. As they prepared dinner together, Dorothy noticed something unusual. Vincent seemed distracted. "What's troubling you?" He hesitated. "This whole situation. Meaning?" "I've spent years believing strength meant protecting people from harm." Dorothy listened quietly. "Now I watch you change more hearts with patience than most people change with force." The room grew silent. Snow tapped softly against the kitchen window. Finally, Dorothy placed a hand over his. "Strength isn't measured by what you can destroy. Then what is it measured by?" "What you choose not to destroy." The words stayed with Vincent long after he left. Meanwhile, Richard Sterling received devastating news. The State Bar Association had launched a formal ethics review. His legal license was under investigation. Without that license, his career effectively ended. For the first time, panic replaced arrogance. He hired consultants, public relations specialists, legal advisors, crisis managers. Everyone offered strategies, apologies, statements, interviews, image rehabilitation campaigns. Yet every proposal faced the same obstacle. The video existed. Millions had watched it. No explanation could erase it. One advisor finally told him the truth. People aren't reacting to one mistake. Then what are they reacting to? They believe they saw the real you. The words struck harder than any courtroom ruling. Late that night, Sterling sat alone in darkness. The penthouse felt enormous, empty, cold. He opened social media. Thousands of comments filled his screen. Many expressed outrage. Others expressed disappointment. A few described similar experiences with men exactly like him. For hours he read silently. Eventually he closed the laptop. For the first time since Rosie's diner, a realization surfaced. Maybe the world wasn't conspiring against him. Maybe he had spent years becoming someone people feared rather than respected. The thought unsettled him. Yet an even greater shock arrived the next morning. A formal notice appeared at his door. Federal investigators were requesting additional records. Several former cases would be reopened. The inquiry had expanded significantly. As Sterling read the document, his hands trembled, because for the first time he understood the truth. The slap inside Rosie's diner had not started a scandal. It had started an excavation, and every day investigators were digging deeper. 3 weeks after the incident at Rosie's diner, Chicago awoke to another storm. Heavy clouds rolled across Lake Michigan. Freezing rain coated sidewalks and rooftops. Commuters hurried through the cold while news stations prepared for another day of coverage surrounding Richard Sterling. The story refused to disappear. If anything, it continued growing. Each investigation uncovered new questions. Each question uncovered new witnesses. Each witness revealed another piece of a much larger puzzle. At the federal building downtown, agents reviewed thousands of pages of documents connected to Sterling's former cases. Patterns began emerging. Cases involving minority employees, cases involving workplace discrimination, cases settled quietly before reaching trial. Individually, none proved wrongdoing. Together, they painted an uncomfortable picture. Meanwhile, Dorothy Washington sat inside a community center on Chicago's South Side. Children filled the room. Teenagers occupied folding chairs. Parents stood along the walls. The event had been organized months earlier, long before the diner incident. Dorothy refused to cancel. When she stepped onto the stage, applause filled the auditorium. She smiled warmly. "Please save your applause," she said. "We're here to talk about your future, not my past." The audience laughed. For the next hour, Dorothy spoke about education, responsibility, perseverance, hope. Not once did she mention Richard Sterling. Not once did she discuss the assault. Instead, she focused entirely on the student sitting before her, as she always had. Among the audience sat several reporters. By evening, clips from her speech spread online. Millions watched. Many expected bitterness. Instead, they saw optimism. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured into local scholarship programs. Volunteer applications increased. Community organizations reported record participation. Without trying, Dorothy had become a source of inspiration. Across town, Richard Sterling watched those same videos from his apartment. Every positive headline about Dorothy created another painful contrast. The public saw grace in her. They saw arrogance in him. For years, Sterling had measured success through money. Now he discovered a different form of wealth. Respect. And he possessed very little of it. That afternoon, his attorney arrived carrying troubling news. The prosecutors aren't interested in a quick settlement anymore. Sterling frowned. Why not? Because new evidence keeps appearing. The attorney placed a folder on the table. Former employees, former clients, former associates, statements, emails. Internal communications. Each document increased potential legal exposure. Sterling stared at the pages silently. The situation had evolved far beyond one public altercation. "How bad is it?" he finally asked. The attorney hesitated. "Worse than last week. Better than next week." The answer lingered heavily between them. Elsewhere, Vincent Washington attended a private dinner hosted by community leaders. The guest list included educators, judges, nonprofit directors, and business owners. Many had known Dorothy for decades. As conversations unfolded, Vincent heard story after story. A scholarship she funded anonymously. A family she helped during a housing crisis. a struggling student she mentored, a young attorney she encouraged to pursue law school. The stories seemed endless. Eventually, one elderly pastor raised his glass. "Most people spend their lives asking what they can receive," he said. Dorothy spent hers asking what she could give. The room fell silent, then everyone nodded. Vincent felt something unexpected: pride. Not because of his own accomplishments, because of hers. Later that evening, he visited his mother. She sat knitting near the living room window. Snow drifted outside, a lamp cast warm light across the room. For a moment, everything felt peaceful. "You look tired," Dorothy observed. "Long day." "Important day." Vincent smiled. "Depends how you define important." Dorothy lowered her knitting. "Try me." He thought carefully. "I spent years building influence. Today I realized you've had more influence than me this entire time." Dorothy laughed softly. "Influence isn't something you build, it's something others give you." The wisdom struck him harder than any business lesson ever had. As the evening continued, neither realized another major development was unfolding. Federal investigators had discovered financial records connected to several questionable transactions inside Sterling's former firm. The documents required further review, possibly criminal review. Shortly before midnight, a federal prosecutor signed additional subpoenas. More records, more witnesses, more scrutiny. The investigation was entering a new phase. And for the first time, Richard Sterling's future no longer depended solely on public opinion. It depended on what investigators might uncover next. As snow continued falling across Chicago, a single thought kept him awake. What if the diner incident was only the beginning of his problems? Deep down, he already knew the answer. By the beginning of December, Chicago wore its winter coat. Snow-covered sidewalks, bare trees stood frozen beneath gray skies. Holiday lights glowed from apartment windows, adding warmth to the cold season. For most residents, life continued normally. For Richard Sterling, every day felt like another step toward disaster. The investigations had expanded beyond anything he imagined. Federal attorneys requested additional documents. Former employees continued cooperating. Journalists uncovered new stories almost weekly. The pressure became relentless. Even simple activities felt impossible. Restaurants recognized him. Strangers whispered. Former colleagues avoided eye contact. His once crowded social calendar sat completely empty. The isolation hurt more than he expected. For the first time in decades, Richard Sterling found himself alone with his own thoughts. Meanwhile, Dorothy Washington spent her mornings exactly as she always had. She volunteered at local schools. She attended church services. She visited neighbors recovering from illness. The attention surrounding her never changed those habits. When reporters praised her courage, she redirected attention toward community programs. When organizations offered awards, she accepted only if the event benefited local students. She remained exactly who she had always been. That consistency fascinated people. Many expected fame to change her. It never did. One snowy afternoon, Dorothy visited Lincoln Elementary School. Children crowded around her as she entered the library. Several recognized her from television. A young girl raised her hand. "Mrs. Washington, were you scared?" The room grew quiet. Dorothy considered the question carefully. "Yes," she answered honestly. The students looked surprised. "But brave people aren't people who never feel fear." She smiled warmly. "They're people who refuse to let fear make their decisions." The children nodded thoughtfully. Teachers wrote down the quote. By evening, photographs from the visit appeared across social media. Thousands shared them. The comments told a remarkable story. Teachers, parents, former students. Many described how Dorothy had influenced their lives years earlier. The ripple effect continued growing. Across downtown Chicago, Vincent met privately with several business leaders. Unlike previous meetings, the conversation focused entirely on the future. Scholarship funds, educational grants, community investments. The group planned initiatives inspired by Dorothy's example. One executive eventually asked the question everyone wondered: "Does your mother know how many lives she's impacted?" Vincent smiled. "Not even close." The answer proved true, because that same evening, Dorothy received a letter from Phoenix. Inside was a handwritten note. The sender was a woman named Rebecca Turner. 30 years earlier, Dorothy had encouraged her to apply for college after a family tragedy nearly ended her education. Today, Rebecca served as a state judge. The letter ended with a simple sentence: "You saw potential in me before I could see it myself." Dorothy read the words twice, then quietly placed the letter beside dozens of others. Each carried a similar message: gratitude, respect, love, things money could never purchase. That night, Richard Sterling received very different correspondence. Another client terminated its relationship. Another organization revoked membership privileges. Another professional association announced disciplinary review. The pattern had become familiar. Every envelope brought loss. Every email delivered consequences. Eventually, he poured himself a drink and stared out at the snowy city. For years, he had believed success created security. Now he understood how fragile that security actually was. Because reputation was not built through wealth. It was built through behavior, and behavior had finally caught up with him. Near midnight, an unexpected phone call arrived. It came from his estranged daughter, Emily. They had not spoken in nearly 3 years. Richard answered immediately. "Emily?" Silence lingered briefly. Then her voice emerged. Calm, measured. "I watched the video." Richard closed his eyes. "Emily, I can explain." "No," she replied quietly. "I think that's the problem. You've spent your whole life explaining instead of listening." The words struck harder than any news report. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Emily continued, "I called because I hope you finally understand something." "What?" "Nobody destroyed your life except you." The line disconnected. Richard remained frozen. The apartment felt unbearably silent. Outside, snow continued falling across Chicago. Inside, a painful realization slowly settled. The investigations, the media coverage, the public outrage, those were consequences, not causes. The cause stared back at him every morning from the mirror, and for the first time, he was beginning to see it clearly. Yet while Richard struggled with that realization, federal investigators made a discovery that would soon change everything. A newly uncovered collection of records connected multiple prior complaints in ways nobody had previously recognized. By dawn, prosecutors would receive the report, and when they did, the case against Richard Sterling would become far more serious than anyone expected. The report arrived at the federal prosecutor's office just after sunrise. Outside, Chicago remained trapped beneath a blanket of snow. Traffic moved slowly. Commuters shuffled through icy streets. The city appeared calm. Inside government offices, however, momentum was building. Federal prosecutor Amanda Reynolds reviewed the newly uncovered documents with growing concern. The records connected multiple complaints spanning more than a decade. Individually, each case appeared insignificant. Together, they suggested something far more troubling. Patterns, repeated behavior, repeated victims, repeated attempts to silence opposition. Amanda closed the file and leaned back. The diner incident had opened a door. What investigators found behind that door was becoming impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Richard Sterling woke after another sleepless night. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes. The luxury penthouse no longer felt luxurious. It felt like a prison with expensive furniture. His phone displayed several missed calls, all from attorneys. None from friends. The distinction hurt. For years, he had surrounded himself with people attracted to status. Now that status was disappearing. So were they. He ignored the calls and walked toward the window. Snowflakes drifted through the morning air. For a brief moment, he remembered simpler times. Before promotions, before wealth, before ambition became obsession. The memory vanished quickly. Reality returned. Across the city, Dorothy Washington attended a community breakfast hosted by local educators. The event celebrated mentoring programs for disadvantaged students. Dozens of teachers filled the hall. Many approached Dorothy throughout the morning. Some thanked her, others shared stories. One young teacher became emotional while speaking. "I almost quit during my first year," she admitted. "What changed?" Dorothy asked. "You." The teacher smiled. "Someone gave me one of your old speeches. I kept it in my desk." Dorothy laughed softly. "I don't even remember my old speeches." "I do." The teacher's eyes filled with tears. "It saved my career." Moments like these happened constantly now. Everywhere Dorothy went, people shared stories. Lives changed, dreams encouraged, opportunities created. The attention embarrassed her. Yet it also revealed something important. Kindness accumulates. Not immediately, not dramatically, but over decades, and eventually its impact becomes impossible to measure. Later that afternoon, Vincent received a private call. The voice on the other end belonged to a senior federal investigator. "We found additional evidence." Vincent listened quietly. "Serious?" "Potentially." The investigator paused, much bigger than the original assault case. After the call ended, Vincent sat alone in silence. He felt no satisfaction, only reflection. Months earlier, he might have celebrated Sterling's downfall. Now he viewed everything differently. His mother's influence was changing him. Justice and revenge no longer felt interchangeable. One healed, the other merely transferred pain. That evening, Dorothy invited Vincent to dinner. Snow continued falling outside while they shared homemade soup and fresh bread. The atmosphere felt warm and peaceful. Eventually, Vincent told her about the expanding investigation. Dorothy listened carefully, then she surprised him. "I hope he learns from it." Vincent stared at her. "After everything he did?" "Especially after everything he did." The answer seemed impossible, yet completely sincere. Dorothy folded her hands. "Punishment changes circumstances, growth changes people." The words lingered long after dinner ended. Across town, Richard Sterling sat inside a law office conference room with his defense team. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. None of the news was positive. Potential federal exposure, additional witnesses, expanded inquiries, growing evidence. When the meeting finally ended, one attorney remained behind. An older man named Charles Bennett. Unlike the others, Bennett spoke plainly. "Richard, can I give you honest advice?" Sterling nodded. "Stop fighting reality." The room fell silent. "What does that mean?" Bennett sighed. "You've spent months blaming reporters, prosecutors, activists, investigators, social media, and everyone else." He leaned forward. "At some point, you have to ask yourself a simple question." "What question?" "What if they're not reacting to one bad day?" Sterling looked away. Deep down, he already knew the answer. Because every new witness described the same man, every new complaint described the same behavior, every new allegation pointed toward the same truth. The problem was not one moment inside Rosie's diner. The problem was who he had become long before he ever walked through its doors. As midnight approached, federal prosecutors finalized their recommendations. Additional charges were now under consideration. The investigation had entered its most critical phase. And somewhere beneath the falling snow, a decision was being prepared that could permanently alter Richard Sterling's future. By morning, his world would become even smaller. The next morning arrived with bitter winds sweeping across Chicago. The city seemed quieter than usual. Heavy clouds concealed the sun, snowbanks lined the streets, holiday decorations sparkled against the gray landscape, creating a strange contrast between celebration and uncertainty. For Richard Sterling, uncertainty had become a permanent companion. At 8:30, his attorney called. The tone of the conversation immediately felt different, more serious, more urgent. "Richard, I need you downtown within the hour." "What's happened?" A pause followed. "Federal prosecutors have made a decision." The words settled heavily in the room. Sterling stared through the penthouse windows toward the frozen skyline. For months, he had watched consequences gather like storm clouds. Now the storm was arriving. Meanwhile, Dorothy Washington spent her morning at St. Matthew's Community Church. Volunteers were preparing holiday food baskets for struggling families. Dorothy moved from table to table, helping organize donations. She greeted everyone by name, remembered birthdays, asked about grandchildren, checked on illnesses. The remarkable thing was how naturally it came to her. Kindness was not something she performed, it was simply who she was. A young volunteer eventually approached. "Mrs. Washington, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "How do you stay positive after everything that's happened?" Dorothy smiled. "Because I refuse to let one person's darkness determine my light." The volunteer stood silently. The answer felt simple, yet profound. Across downtown, federal prosecutors formally announced expanded proceedings connected to several newly uncovered findings. News organizations immediately interrupted regular programming. Breaking news banners appeared. Commentators rushed to analyze developments. The story once again dominated headlines. Inside a conference room, Richard Sterling sat surrounded by legal counsel. The atmosphere felt grim. No optimistic predictions remained. No easy solutions. No escape routes. One attorney summarized the situation bluntly. "The evidence keeps growing." Another added, "Your credibility is gone." Sterling remained silent. For the first time in his professional life, he lacked an argument. Facts had become stronger than excuses. That afternoon, Vincent received an invitation to speak at a major civic leadership event. He declined. Then another invitation arrived, and another. He declined those as well. Public recognition held little interest. Instead, he redirected every request toward community programs inspired by Dorothy. Educational initiatives, mentorship opportunities, scholarship funds. People began noticing. Reporters expected a powerful son seeking publicity. Instead, they found a man determined to keep attention focused on meaningful change. Late that evening, Vincent visited his mother. The apartment smelled of cinnamon and fresh coffee. Holiday music played softly in the background. For a while, they simply sat together. Comfortable silence, the kind shared only between people who know each other completely. Eventually, Dorothy spoke. "You seem peaceful." Vincent considered the observation. "I think I finally understand something." "What's that?" "You spent your entire life building people." Dorothy waited, "and that's why everyone showed up when you needed them." She smiled gently. "People aren't investments, Vincent." "I know." "Then why did they help?" He thought carefully. Finally, he answered, "Because they loved you." Dorothy's eyes softened. No further explanation was necessary. Across town, Richard Sterling sat alone once more. The television displayed another interview discussing Dorothy's influence on the community. Former students shared stories. Community leaders offered praise. Teachers described her impact. The contrast became impossible to ignore. One person built relationships, the other built status. When crisis arrived, only one foundation remained standing. For the first time, genuine regret began replacing self-pity. Not regret over getting caught, regret over becoming the person visible in that video. The realization hurt, because deep down, he knew something devastating. Even if the legal consequences disappeared tomorrow, some losses could never be recovered. Trust, respect, character, those required years to build and only moments to destroy. Near midnight, a final development emerged. The State Bar Association completed its review. A formal decision would be announced within days. The outcome would determine whether Richard Sterling could ever practice law again. As snow drifted quietly beyond the windows, he stared at the notification on his screen. For the first time in many months, he felt truly afraid, because this decision threatened something even more important than money. It threatened the identity he had spent his entire life constructing, and deep inside, he suspected that identity was already gone. 3 days before Christmas, Chicago awoke beneath a brilliant winter sunrise. For the first time in weeks, clear blue skies stretched across the city. Snow-covered rooftops reflected golden light. The frozen lake shimmered beneath the morning sun. The beauty stood in sharp contrast to the tension building inside government offices, law firms, and newsrooms. A major announcement was expected. Everyone knew it. Nobody knew exactly what form it would take. At 10 o'clock, the State Bar Association released its decision. Richard Sterling's license to practice law was permanently revoked. The statement cited ethical misconduct, professional dishonesty, discriminatory behavior, and conduct unbecoming of an officer of the court. Within minutes, every major news organization carried the story. The reaction was immediate. Legal experts called the decision historic. Former colleagues expressed disappointment. Community leaders described it as accountability. For Richard Sterling, it felt like the final collapse of a life he no longer recognized. He sat alone in silence after reading the announcement. No anger came, no outrage, no excuses, only emptiness. For decades, being an attorney had defined him. It shaped his identity, his reputation, his sense of worth. Now it was gone. The title that once opened every door meant nothing. Across the city, Dorothy Washington learned the news while helping prepare a holiday reading program for children. A volunteer showed her the article. Dorothy read it quietly, then handed the phone back. "That's sad," she said. The volunteer looked surprised. "Sad? A life doesn't fall apart overnight. It falls apart one choice at a time." The answer reflected everything Dorothy believed. She saw consequences. But she also saw tragedy. Not because Sterling escaped responsibility, because he had spent years walking toward it without realizing where the path led. That afternoon, Vincent joined his mother for lunch at Rosie's diner. The restaurant was crowded, holiday decorations hung from the walls. Christmas music played softly from overhead speakers. Customers greeted Dorothy warmly as she entered. Some waved, others stopped by the table. Everyone seemed genuinely happy to see her. Vincent observed quietly. For years, he had commanded respect through power. His mother inspired affection through character. The difference felt increasingly important. As lunch continued, Maria Santos approached their booth. "Dorothy, there's something you should see." She handed over a large scrapbook. Inside were hundreds of letters, former students, parents, neighbors, community members, people from every stage of Dorothy's life. Each letter described an act of kindness, a moment of encouragement, a life changed, a dream saved. Dorothy turned the pages slowly, her eyes filled with tears. Not because of recognition, because she had forgotten many of the moments entirely. To her, they had seemed small. To others, they had been life-changing. Vincent watched silently. Then he noticed something remarkable. Every story shared a common theme. His mother had seen value in people before they saw it in themselves. That was her gift. Not influence, not power, belief. That evening, Richard Sterling experienced a very different moment. His daughter Emily appeared unexpectedly at his apartment. The visit surprised him. He had not expected forgiveness. He barely expected conversation. They sat across from each other for nearly an hour before either spoke. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "Do you know what your biggest mistake was?" Richard looked down. "Probably a long list." "No," she shook her head. "You spent your life treating people like obstacles instead of people." The words landed heavily, because they were true, painfully true. For the first time, Richard didn't argue, didn't defend himself, didn't explain. He simply listened, and perhaps that mattered more than anything else. Outside, Christmas lights illuminated the snowy streets. Families gathered. Church bells echoed through neighborhoods. The city prepared for celebration. Yet beneath the holiday atmosphere, another story was quietly reaching its conclusion. Not the story of Richard Sterling's downfall. That chapter was nearly finished. The real story had always belonged to Dorothy Washington, a woman who answered hatred with dignity, cruelty with grace, division with humanity. And as Christmas Eve approached, an invitation arrived at Dorothy's apartment. It came from the mayor's office. Inside was a formal request. The city wanted to honor her publicly, not for surviving what happened, but for the example she had set afterward. Dorothy smiled as she read the letter. Then she looked out at the falling snow. She had no idea that the event being planned would become one of the most meaningful days of her life. Christmas Eve arrived with fresh snow covering Chicago in white silence. Church bells echoed across neighborhoods, storefront windows glowed with warm light. Families gathered around dinner tables while children counted the hours until morning. For Dorothy Washington, the day began like any other. She woke before sunrise. She brewed coffee. She watered her plants. She spent a few quiet moments reading beside the living room window. Then her phone began ringing. Former students, old friends, neighbors, people from every chapter of her life called to wish her a Merry Christmas. Each conversation reminded her how blessed she truly was, not because of awards, not because of recognition, but because of relationships. Later that afternoon, a city vehicle arrived outside her apartment. Dorothy had almost forgotten about the mayor's invitation. The ceremony was scheduled for that evening. She had assumed only a handful of officials would attend. She was wrong, very wrong. When she entered the historic civic auditorium downtown, she stopped walking. The massive room was full. Hundreds of people stood waiting: teachers, police officers, judges, business leaders, students, parents, community volunteers, people from every corner of the city. Many had traveled hours to be there, others had flown in from different states. The moment Dorothy entered, the audience rose to its feet. A standing ovation filled the hall. The applause continued for nearly 2 minutes. Dorothy covered her mouth with one hand. Tears finally appeared. Not from pain, from gratitude. Mayor Patricia Johnson stepped to the podium. "Tonight is not about a viral video," she began. "Tonight is about a lifetime of service." The audience applauded. For decades, Dorothy Washington invested in this city without asking for recognition. She educated children, strengthened families, encouraged future leaders, helped neighbors, solved problems, created opportunities. The mayor paused, and when faced with hatred, she responded with dignity that inspired an entire nation. More applause followed. Then something unexpected happened. One by one, people approached the stage: a surgeon from Houston, a judge from Phoenix, an educator from Detroit, a business owner from Atlanta, former students whose lives Dorothy had touched years earlier. Each shared a brief story. Each described a moment when Dorothy believed in them, a moment that changed everything. The stories continued for nearly an hour. By the end, many audience members were openly crying, including Vincent. Seated quietly in the front row, he listened to dozens of strangers describe the woman he called Mom. Yet as the stories unfolded, he realized something profound. Even he had underestimated her impact. Dorothy had built something far greater than success. She had built legacy. When her turn finally came to speak, the room became silent. Dorothy approached the podium slowly. She looked across the crowd, then smiled. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. The audience laughed gently, which is unusual for a retired teacher. More laughter followed, then her expression softened. "People keep asking what I learned from everything that happened this year." The room listened carefully. "I learned that kindness matters more than we realize. Most of us never see the full impact of our actions. We encourage someone, help someone, believe in someone. Then life moves on." She glanced toward the audience. Years later, those small moments return in ways we never expected. The room remained completely silent. The world doesn't change because of powerful people. It changes because ordinary people choose compassion over cruelty, courage over fear, and hope over bitterness. Many wiped away tears. Vincent lowered his head briefly. Pride filled his heart, not the pride of achievement, the pride of knowing he had been raised by an extraordinary woman. After the ceremony ended, Dorothy and Vincent stepped outside together. Snowflakes drifted through the night air. The city lights reflected across the white streets. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, Vincent smiled. "You were right, Ma." "About what?" "Strength isn't measured by what you can destroy." Dorothy squeezed his hand. "No, sweetheart. It's measured by what you build." Across the city, Richard Sterling sat alone in a small apartment he had recently rented after selling the penthouse. His life looked very different now. Simpler, quieter, uncertain. On television, he watched highlights from Dorothy's ceremony. For a long time, he stared silently at the screen. Then he turned it off. Not out of anger, out of understanding. The woman he had dismissed as insignificant had revealed something he never learned during his years of success. True influence comes from serving others. True respect is earned. True power leaves people better than it found them. Outside, Christmas snow continued falling across Chicago. And somewhere beneath those quiet winter skies, thousands of lives carried Dorothy Washington's influence forward into another generation. Her story had never been about surviving one terrible moment. It had always been about the extraordinary impact of a life lived with dignity, compassion, and purpose. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share this video.